All right. Hello, everybody, and hello, everybody who's joining us online. We will do a couple of housekeeping notes. I'm Jacqueline Sundberg. I'm outreach librarian here at the Rare Books and Special Collections. So welcome to this talk by my colleague who's right here. I'll introduce her in a minute. But first, I'm going to do a final check to make sure that everyone in the Zoom room can hear me just fine. So we do have a hybrid event, so we've got a crowd of people in the Zoom room, although they're invisible. So you can enjoy being a ghost for the moment if you're joining us on Zoom. You are joining an in-person room as well. We are here today for this that you see on screen, everything but the blueprint, what archival documentation reveals about the architect as a student, educator, and practitioner. And we are going to have a sort of three-part event today. We're going to have a talk by the curator, Tellina Liu. We're going to have a question and answer period, and then we're going to actually walk, for those of you who are here in person, out, and she'll give us a tour of the cases themselves. So we'll get to explore that space in person. For those of you online, we will end after the talk and Q&A. So you can have a very long walk to join us in person if you're motivated, but you might not make it in time. Before we go further, I want to do a land acknowledgement about where we're joining you from. So if you're tuning in from elsewhere, welcome. We are joining you from the McGill University downtown campus, and this is land that has long served as a place of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank these diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence mark the territory on which peoples of the world, including us today, are now gathering. The McGill Libraries recognize the harm that cultural heritage organizations, as colonial institutions, have inflicted on Indigenous peoples, and we are committed to the ongoing process of reconciliation as a way to begin to right these wrongs. And you see that these words on screen, and every time we do an event, it's a moment to reflect on what they mean to us. And one of the things that every event reinforces is that this is an ongoing exchange of knowledge, and every event that we have is a way for us to communicate the treasures in our collections that came to us from all over. So today we'll be hearing specifically about some of the architecture material from Tellina. And for those of you who are joining us online, if you do need help or you have issues with the Zoom, you can email me. My email address is on screen. It's my name, jacqueline.sundberg@mcgill.ca, or you can chat to me in the Zoom chat. And I will just have a quick look. Still fine. Okay. Still fine. Just double checking. I don't want you to be excluded if you're stuck somewhere in Zoom land. So before Tellina takes over, I'm just gonna, now that I've pointed her to her 4 times, I will give you her proper introduction. She is the archivist responsible for the Moshe Safdie Archives here at McGill. She also does a lot of other work, as we were just discussing, helping patrons and users who are researching materials in our architectural collections and beyond. She has worked in museum, corporate, and religious archives before she joined our McGill team here. And her past work as an architect and historic preservationist, which I need to ask you more about over coffee someday, now inform her work here with the archival and architectural collections at McGill. So join me in welcoming Tellina and let her tell you about the exhibition.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming to listen to my curator talk, and thank you, Jacqueline, for the kind introduction. As Jacqueline mentioned, my name is Tellina Liu, and I'm an archivist who works primarily with the architectural archives at McGill. Today, I'll be talking about my exhibition, Everything But the Blueprint, what archival documentation reveals about the architect as student, educator, and practitioner, as well as my curatorial process. Before I begin, I want to thank Jessica Huang, an undergraduate student who helped me select items and assisted with exhibition installation. She'll be joining us for the second part or third part of this talk, where we gather by the exhibition. And I know she'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have about her experience, contributions, or discoveries. So I believe that every exhibition is an opportunity to introduce collections to visitors and to encourage engagement with archival materials. The John Bland Canadian Architecture Collection, or CAC, is extensive and contains approximately 200,000 plans and drawings, as well as photographs, slides, documents, and models. So I had a lot of material to explore. Where would I start then with so many fonts available? Much of the collection consists of blueprints and other measure drawings, and most researchers and visitors think of these drawings first, or only think of these drawings when they think about the CAC. A large part of the collection also reflects the work of well-known architects. As an archivist who is interested in discovering new archival materials for use and research, as well as making all collections available, I wanted to try and consider lesser known fonts or items. My first idea was to focus on ephemera. The idea of ephemera might be considered antithetical to archival collections, but a lot of ephemera does end up in the archive. Additionally, I wondered what would be considered ephemera in an architectural collection, since architectural drawings and documents are meant to last at least as long as the building, or even longer. Another factor that I considered was the physical exhibition space itself. In the fourth floor lobby, I had access to these 4 cases, which you can see in these images. These cases can only accommodate materials of a certain size. Given that many of our architectural drawings are 36 inches by 48 inches, I knew that I would have to consider smaller items if I wanted to display original archival materials in the exhibition. To select materials for consideration, I began looking through our finding aids, digital guides, and collection lists, noting folders and boxes with potential ephemeral materials. I also tasked Jessica with an open exploration of the CAC. I encouraged her to open drawers and look through archival folders, bookmarking anything with visual interest or any documents that reflected anything intriguing about architecture or architects. I also know that visitors to an exhibition might not view everything, so any selections we made needed to express something meaningful or interesting on their own. During this process, I realized that looking at architectural ephemera wouldn't result in enough items for an exhibition, so I expanded my search. I still decided not to consider any measure drawings due to their size and my desire to dive more deeply into the collection, but all other formats were considered. These images show the types of materials that we found, and these include non-measure drawings, architectural studies, correspondence, and advertisements. Not all of these images shown here are in the exhibition, but all of them were considered. Once I had an initial selection, I started looking for connections between the materials or a theme that would tie everything together. I was able to sort the items into 3 groups: those representing the architect as a student, as a practitioner, and as an educator. Perhaps these categories should have been more obvious to me, considering the CAC's collection policy, which focuses on accepting materials from students and professors from McGill's School of Architecture, as well as the works of architects practicing in Montreal and Quebec. However, even when taking the collections policy into consideration, researchers normally tend to focus on the documents and drawings of practicing architects. So exploring materials from students and educators was new and different. I also discovered that the selected materials expressed connections between the 3 roles and showed how these roles affected each other. By looking at the archival materials depicting the architect as student, educator, and practitioner, I hoped that the exhibition would reflect unexplored facets of the collection. In the next few slides, I'll discuss each of the 4 cases, and I'll also highlight a few items from each case. In the first case, I focused on the architect as student and the architect as educator. We found multiple examples of student notebooks from the 1920s and 1930s, including this bound volume from G.E. Wilson, showing his notes from an architecture history class about medieval architecture, which he created in 1932 or 1933. In addition to these notes, students in these classes honed their drawing skills because they needed to draw all of the reference images by hand. Here's another example of a student notebook. This one is from Hugh Valentine, which was created in 1928. This bound volume was also made for an architecture history class, which was titled Gothic Architecture to Modern Architecture. These notebooks reflect the way that architectural history classes were taught in the early decades of the 1900s, as well as the relatively unchanging nature of these classes during that time. They also provide an opportunity to show current students what was taught historically, as well as the skills and the work those students undertook in their studies. I also want to point out this charcoal sketch by Hugh McLennan, which you see on the left. Unfortunately, he died while fighting in World War I, so we only have his student works. However, he does leave behind a larger legacy. His family created a scholarship in his name, and the Hugh McLennan Memorial Scholarship is still awarded to the student who has maintained the highest standing throughout their professional studies in the School of Architecture. His collection, though small, reflects another reality of architecture as well. Not everyone who studies architecture becomes an architect for a variety of reasons, but the work they complete as students can still contribute to our understanding of the history of architectural education. In contrast to the student work shown in this case, we also have course notes from McGill architecture professors. The two examples here are from Peter Collins, one from 1967 and the other from 1980 to 1981. You can see from these two documents that the architecture history courses did evolve since the 1930s. Collins is teaching about archaeology, the history of ideas, and even considers why architectural history courses are taught. These changes show how architecture educators incorporated new ideas and disciplines other than architecture into their classes, which then affected how students learned about the architecture profession and its history. Additionally, this case shows how students began to express more agency and involvement in their own education. Here in these photographs, you can see students constructing a geodesic dome that was designed by Buckminster Fuller. In 1956, the students invited Fuller to teach a seminar. This included an opportunity for them to build this dome. So the documents in this first case show how architectural education changed in the 20th century through the perspective of both educators and students. In the second case, I focused on the architect as student and the architect as practitioner. This case shows how the actual practice of architecture differs from the conception of the profession from the perspective of a student. And as Jacqueline mentioned, I am someone who studied architecture and practiced as an architect, so the materials in this case really resonated with me. This case begins with sketchbooks and photographs from student travel notebooks. These images reflect a period of study and exploration as a student absorbs information about architectural styles, forms, and materials. During these travels, students refine their design aesthetic and develop their own architectural ideas as they integrate their travel experiences with what they're taught in school. Even for students who don't travel abroad, their time at school is spent understanding the built environment around them through the lens of their education. It's poignant to note that we have the travel drawings and photographs from G.E. Wilson because he won the Hugh McLennan Memorial Scholarship. Wilson was able to travel to Europe through the scholarship, and he also used these materials to publish an article for the Journal of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. In contrast to the student sketches and photographs, I also included architectural contracts and specifications. Specifications are written documents that architects create to describe the technical requirements for a project, which can include materials needed, quality standards, and methods of construction. These materials are placed in the same case to provide a contrast between the more pragmatic elements of the architecture profession with the more idealistic view from students during their time at school when they have the freedom to explore and to try out new ideas. Also, students don't always have the opportunity to learn about these practical details of architectural work while they're at school. So I believe that this is an opportunity to use the archives to show students a professional reality. This case shows the practicality of the profession, but also calls on practitioners to retain some of the exploratory, open nature of their time as students in their own professional work. In the third case, I focused on the relationship between the architect as educator and the architect as practitioner. In the 1940s, John Bland, the then director of the School of Architecture, changed the architecture curriculum and hired new professors. F. Cyril James, who was the principal of McGill at that time, wrote a letter, which is shown in the center here, asking Bland to justify his decisions and to submit a report to that effect. The report, which is shown on the right, conveys the results of a survey that Bland conducted of other architectural programs in North America and how he understood that the architecture profession was evolving. The grouping of documents in the center of the case, which you'll see later, reflects a series of correspondence between Bland and James discussing the changes to architectural education and practice. The correspondence and report act as a thesis of sorts for the case, and the surrounding documentation proves Bland's assertions. Bland posited that the architect, rather than remaining just a designer or artist, needed to become more proficient in technical and engineering skills. The case holds a report on the McGill demonstration training course for construction industry integration to show the school's interest in providing that training for architecture students. Also, Bland argued that the architect should be involved in public relations by promoting their own work and reaching out to new audiences. One way that architects were asked to promote their work was through publications. While these publications by G.E. Wilson are not scholarly in nature, they did promote the architecture profession. They were written for regular people who were often unable to hire their own architects to design houses. These people learned about architecture design elements through Wilson's works, and he demystified the architectural profession and enabled people to make better architectural design decisions for their own homes. Another change in the profession is reflected by John Bland noting that architects should become city and community planners. The Arthur Erickson Fund contains many urban planning project documents, as well as items that involve institutional and government clients. Bland also stated that architects need to expand their education into the humanities, particularly in the fields of economics, sociology, and political science. There are archival materials from the Buckminster Fuller Fund, in this case, that show him presenting his ideas of architectural solutions to larger worldwide problems to the United States Congress, as well as his creation of a new world map where continents are not distorted in size and shape. Architects, Bland argued, should be encouraged to be thinkers and problem solvers. This case shows how John Bland intended to prepare architecture students for a changing profession, and the archival materials also reflect the reality of how architects have become more than just designers and artists. No worries. In the fourth case, I focused on the architect as practitioner, but noting that even within practice, student and educator involvement can be found. As an architecture collection in Montreal, I felt that it was understandable and reasonable to focus a case on Expo 67, where we are displaying archival materials that we have on pavilions and other built projects. In these images, you can see that I've selected color drawings and photographs from the Sigrid Bülow-Hubé Fond. Bülow-Hubé was an interior designer and furniture designer who furnished an apartment at Habitat. Her collection is also interesting because she isn't an architect and is one of a few interior designers that we have at the CAC. We also have sketches from Moshe Safdie, created during his work on the design of Habitat 67. He is an alumnus of McGill, and we are now the custodians of his professional archive, which is still growing. In addition to having many projects beyond Habitat, we also have materials from his time as a student at McGill. Due to the significance of Habitat 67, we have over 160 drawing folders, dozens of project file boxes, as well as sketchbooks and models that trace this project from its initial planning stages through construction. I also like to position drawings of a building with drawings of their interiors or landscapes when possible to show how collaborative architectural practice is in reality. A project takes architects, engineers, contractors, and being able to represent that collaborative work through the archives is important. Beyond the expected Expo 67 materials, I found archival documentation for a conference that was held during Expo, the World Design Science Decade 1965 to 1975 conference, with Buckminster Fuller as one of the main speakers. This conference was planned with the help of the School of Architecture at McGill, and students were encouraged to sign up and attend. The materials in this fourth case show how archival collections can document connections that are not immediately known to everyone. And it also shows how intertwined students, educators, and practitioners can be in unexpected ways. While the cases are a good introduction to the work of architects as students, educators, and practitioners, I was unable to display everything that we had selected. The following slides show some of the materials that are not on display, and I'll also discuss the reasoning behind those choices. Here we have the manuscript for one of G.E. Wilson's publications. And while it's interesting to see his original drawings and manuscript drafts, I would need an entire case or more dedicated to them to be able to display every page. I had to select just one page for the exhibition in addition to the publications. But I hope that students or visitors find these materials interesting enough to request an appointment for further consultation. Similarly, I have quotes and survey documentation from John Bland that he consolidated into the report about the changes in the architecture profession and the resulting changes necessary to architectural education. The decision to not include these materials was made in part due to the amount of space that I would need to be able to show everything. Also, there were other considerations. Some of these items, like the quote that you can see on the left, would not be immediately understood by a visitor to the exhibition without additional context. Since I decided that an item needed to be able to stand on its own in the exhibition, I wouldn't be able to select any of the quotes, even though they're interesting and do provide additional context to the report. Furthermore, I think as you can see here, all of these documents are extremely text heavy and aren't particularly visually interesting, so I didn't select them for display. And finally, we have images here from one of Safdie's sketchbooks. Some of the earlier studies that he conducted are not immediately or easily connected to habitat and were therefore not selected for display. In my selections, I tried to find sketches and documents that are easy to understand and can be obviously tied to habitat. And also, as I mentioned, there's a lot of habitat-related material, so most of the project files and drawings can't be displayed in this exhibition. So here is a final glimpse into more of my curatorial process. After selections were made, I utilized the space at the CEC to lay out materials as they would be displayed in the cases. I then made determinations on what supports were needed and what information was necessary to create labels, both in terms of individual labels as well as the case labels. In these images, you'll see items that didn't make the final cut when we go outside. Even with the luxury of space, adding supports changed the dimensions to some of these materials, and the layouts that I created no longer worked. Additionally, you can see that everything is flat in these photographs. In the final exhibition, I wanted there to be a variety of heights and angles to add visual interest in order to encourage visitors to the fourth floor to stop and engage with the exhibition. Overall, I think the exhibition is successful in representing the architect as student, educator, and practitioner through the display of archival materials. I believe that it also begins to uncover connections between the different roles and shows how these roles have affected one another throughout the 20th century. I also appreciated the ability to treat each case differently and to incorporate materials based on the needs and theme of each. I wasn't able to have an exhibition of entirely unknown or lesser known architects, but I am happy that I was able to include some smaller fonds among the more well-known practitioners. Um, Also, I am um, gratified to note that I have been able to give tours of the exhibition to students, including some architecture students, and they've responded positively to the items I've selected and to the themes that I'm exploring in this exhibition. I've enjoyed the opportunity to explore the John Bland Canadian Architecture Collection for this exhibition, and I hope that visitors to the exhibition can learn something new or see something that is unexpected. So thank you all very much for the opportunity to speak to you about the exhibition and my curatorial process. Um, I hope that some of you will be able to join me after this as we view the exhibition. And for those joining us virtually, I hope you have the opportunity to stop by and visit the exhibition in person. Thank you again, and I welcome any questions that you might have. Great.
So we welcome other questions and comments. That one was a comment about Expo and about the meeting of disciplines and the purpose of that one. I have a question for you.
Oh, sure.
My eye was particularly caught by the Sigrun Hube furniture, which I have seen drawings. So you had a slide on the screen there, and I was curious. Well, we'll see what there is out in the cases, but I was curious what really caught your attention about that fall in particular. And also, follow-up question before you answer the first. If you could ask her to design a table for the CAC, what would the ask be? What would be the specs for a table, the ideal table for the CAC?
Well, I think the collection is interesting, as I mentioned, because we don't have a lot of like interior designers or landscape designers in the collection, even though they are designers and they should be part of our CAC materials. And also, I think it's so interesting that her drawings are really amazing and they're so visually striking that I think they just call out to be displayed in an exhibition. Um, and there's also photographs. So not only can you see the drawings of the furniture that she designed, you can actually sort of see them in situ as they would have been when Expo was happening. And if I had her, I mean, she's not able to design anything anymore because I don't think she's alive. But if she were, and I was able to plan something. Honestly, I think at the CAC, I just need space. So any table that is large enough to hold these, 36 by 48 drawings or even larger would be greatly appreciated. I do host tours in the CAC. So really, I just need as much flat surface available. And then the design I would leave entirely to her.
Thanks, Tellina. Given your own history as an architecture student and as someone who's giving tours now to current architecture students, what was the most interesting part or most interesting discovery? Was there anything unexpected that you discovered in charting the trajectory of architectural education? Or what, I don't know, like what brought back something from your studies? And what have been some of the reactions of current students, especially in the era of CAD design, where hand drawing is perhaps, and I don't know if this is totally accurate, is hand drawing perhaps less emphasized in current architectural education, and what are some of their reactions to those types of materials?
Yeah, I think actually the thing that was the most surprising to me was the series of correspondence between the principal of McGill and John Bland. I think, again, as the perspective of someone who was an architecture student, you really don't usually get an insight into the minds of like administrators and how the department might be fighting battles with like the larger university. And I think it's so interesting that John Blaine was really pushing for these changes because he was seeing that the profession was changing and he wanted to ensure that the students at the School of Architecture were prepared for this new environment and that they would have the skills that they needed to actually be able to find work and be able to, work as architects. So that was not something I expected to find. And Jessica, who is now here, was the one who was looking through the bland materials and pointed them out. So I think that was particularly interesting to me and surprising. That is actually one of the things that students have also been responding to. I did a tour for an architecture history class, and they are looking at the history of architecture through the profession. And so, again, I think that is just not something that people think about in architectural collections. As I said at the beginning, most people think of drawings, blueprints, and they don't really think about like correspondence and other sorts of like regular archival documentation. The other thing that I think students really respond well to are the Wilson publications. Again, so these publications were made in the 1950s, and he's basically saying, even though I'm an architect, you don't need me. Like, you can just read this book and it'll tell you about how to put together a floor plan, how to design your own kitchens, your own living rooms, your own spaces. And then I don't have to be involved in any of this. And you don't have to spend the money on an architect, but you are able to design a house that you enjoy and actually does have some sort of like architectural character and design. And I think, again, students are in their most sort of idealistic phase when they're studying architecture in university. And so I think that also resonates with them as an answer potentially to things like housing shortages, and how does the architect facilitate solving these solutions without necessarily, needing their clients to have an exorbitant amount of money. Oh, sure.
If no one else does, I'll ask another one and then we can. So that you used some language that I totally connect to when you were talking about the student case. You were talking about ideals and this sort of idealistic vision of architecture as they traveled and observed structures and materials and inspiration from around the world in different places. And then you have that contrasted with some of the practical documents in the practice case. And I was curious whether that language choice is intentional, and if you as a student and then a practitioner, is there like an aha moment where the ideal just kind of goes away or gets popped, or does that survive? Like that,
Yeah.
you've charted both paths, but not necessarily that moment of transition between the two.
Yeah, so even though Chris Burns, who's the director of Rare Books, is not currently here, when I was, oh, well, hi, Chris. Well, when I was showing him this exhibition and I was walking him through the exhibition, he was like, wow, this case is really personal for you. And it is true, because I think I really enjoyed studying architecture. Nobody here would have ever liked to live or work or be in a building that I designed, because they were all very conceptual. They were all very interesting to me, and I was always exploring some new idea or some new form, but they really were not practical and were not designed for like human beings to exist within. And so I think, as I mentioned in my talk, when we're in architecture school, no one's like, here's a set of construction documents that you will actually be creating. Here are contracts that you're going to have to learn about so that you can, be licensed as an architect in the future. Here are specifications. No one tells you that you might be doing research on like different types of paint or like nails and screws and other materials that you would need in any kind of building, but they're all really important to the actual practice of an architect. And so I really did want to contrast those two parts of that trajectory of the moment when you're in school and you were taught to be open, to explore, to think about all of these ideas, to form your own architectural identity. But part of me does wish that when I was in school, I had been able to see some of the actual realities of what it meant to practice as an architect, because then I don't know that I would have found that crash so difficult when I was working as an architect and I was just designing the same restaurant space for like months on end or drawing details for columns. I wish I had some of that experience while I was in school, while I was, forming my own design identity. Yeah.
A great answer.
Yeah.
Thanks for adding the personal notes. And I will ask you all to join me in thanking Tellina for her talk. It's always a pleasure. I am happy to host these because you get to peek inside your colleagues' brains, which you don't actually get always over the non-existent water cooler because we don't have one on the floor. There's a water fountain. We should meet by the fountain more often. But it really is a pleasure to hear from you about your exhibition experience. So now we will say goodbye to the folks online, and we will invite all of you here in person to go with us through the reading room out to the cases.
Thank you, everyone online.